Just as the Toledot of Isaac is really the Jacob stories, so the Toledot of Jacob is really the Joseph and his brother stories. It's not just Joseph. In fact, the stories really are the whole tribe, or the whole clan of all the tribes. So we need to see the Joseph stories, which is what we usually think about in terms of the whole of the Israelite nation. When we come to this section, beginning in chapter 37, verse 2 is where we see the Toledot, and from there on, it's going to be the concluding saga of the book of Genesis. These stories are going to present God's working in the family of Jacob to produce the outworking that he has in mind. Again, third set of structures is very similar to the first two. So just like the Abraham stories has the chiasm with the concluding remarks, the Jacob stories have the chiasm with the concluding remarks, so the Joseph stories also have the chiasm with the concluding remarks. In this case, the first few chapters, from chapters 37 through chapter 44, begins, as we've seen already, with a word from God. In this case, it's a vision. We also see this culminating in the pivot, or the middle of this chiasm, where the answer at least is given, and we see the initial fulfillment. In this half of the section, in the first narratives here, we really see a number of threats to the promise as Joseph is sold into slavery, as famine comes over the land, and of course he gets deeper and deeper away from what seems to be God's promises until finally at the 11th hour he's drawn out of the pit and he becomes head over Egypt. In addition, as we walk through this, we see the awful character of the brothers of Joseph. He is the lone shining star, but Judah, the ringleader, Reuben, who is the firstborn and should be taking the lead, is in the background, unwilling to confront his brothers. We see all of them selling him into slavery. We see Judah and his immorality. We see the cowardice of the brothers. There's just a number of things in this section that show that these brothers seem unworthy of the promise and of the blessing. So how is that going to work out? When we get to the middle, what we're going to find out is that God has been at work in their lives. And so when we get the answer from Judah to Joseph's question about keeping just Benjamin and sending everybody home, and Judah pleads for him, we realize that God has been at work. And over these 20 years or so that they have been really out of the limelight between selling Joseph into slavery and answering the question, the guilt and the working of God have done their work in the hearts of these brothers. In the beginning of this narrative, we see a number of parallels between the Jacob stories and the Joseph stories, or if you will, the Toledot of Isaac and the Toledot of Jacob. There's just a number of things that seem to fit together so parallel. So we have an oracle of promised blessing in both cases. In both cases, we see who the favored child is going to be. In both cases, the father is deceived. Of course, Jacob does the deceiving in the Jacob stories, and Jacob is the deceived one in the Joseph stories, but in both cases we see that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The kids are much like the parents. We also see treachery between brothers, again, just as we saw in Jacob and Esau, so now we see among the 12. In this case, not just stealing a birthright, but stealing a life, or at least that's what they thought. In both cases, the younger brother is the person of interest. It's centered around him. So in both cases, the younger brother is exiled in a foreign land for 20 years. It was 20 years for Jacob. It will be 20 years for Joseph. In both cases, they are subjected to a period of servitude where both of them are much under the thumb of their masters. In both cases, however, they're both raised to power and blessing. And we see both in Jacob and in Joseph the promise of God being fulfilled, and God doing exactly what he said he would do in spite of what seemed to be insurmountable obstacles. We also recognize that in both cases we have God's sovereign intervention. It is only God who can do this. We have God's sovereign protection. It is only God who can do this. We recognize that in both cases it is scheming foreigners that are the problem, and in both cases, in both cases we also have scheming brothers that are part of the problem as well, don't we? In the conclusion to both sets of narratives, we also have some similarities. So they both end with reconciliation among brothers. They both end with seeing God's work in everybody's heart. There's forgiveness, and the treachery that was there is no longer remembered. And in both cases, there's generosity, and there's a generous giving of the one who was wronged to the one who did the wronging. Chapter 38, again, just like chapter 26, chapter 38 seems to interrupt the narrative flow. So he's going down to Egypt all of a sudden. Whoop, hold on, wait a minute, we've got this little story we need to tell you. Well, the story has to do with Judah. Why Judah? Well, one reason is very possibly that Judah is the ringleader that has sold Joseph into slavery. So Judah is sort of the main culprit at this point. On the other hand, we also know, and I think this is also very significant, that Judah is going to take the lead. The oldest son, Reuben, never does. Judah will. He leads in a bad way in chapter 37 as we look forward and we see the brothers having to bring Benjamin back and think he's going to be put in prison. We see Judah leading in a good way. And what we also recognize, of course, is that when his father gives out the blessings, Judah is the one who is going to have preeminence. He's going to be the ruler. It's going to be through his line. Of course, he will never be ruler, but it's through his line that the ruler will come. And so Jesus, looking down through the quarters of time, Jesus will be the ultimate descendant of Judah who will be on the throne. And that's a bit of a surprise because Joseph is the one that seems to be the favored son. How does this work? Well, we'll have to look ahead to that and see how it comes about. But in chapter 38, what we see is how bad Judah really is. So Judah has 3 boys, and he marries off his oldest boy to this nice Canaanite girl by the name of Tamar. His son is wicked, and so God takes the life of and just as the custom is, in order to raise up descendants to by Tamar, he marries her off to Onan, the second born. Now, Onan realizes that Tamar is going to have the first kid is going to be really kid and going to have his inheritance. So Onan just uses her and abuses her, but refuses to give up the seed. And so Tamar does not get pregnant. Well, there's another son, but he apparently is still a bit young for marrying. And so Judah says, nah, you just go on home. I'll get him to you later. But Judah really has no intention of doing that because Shelah is his only son left, and he's afraid that if God has taken the lives of the first 2, he's going to take the life of his third as well. He probably knows the character of his son as well. Well, Tamar waits until it is well past time when she should have been given to him in marriage and realizes that this is a problem. Judah's wife has died now, and Judah's going up to shear the sheep, and so Tamar pretends to be a prostitute. Judah sees her. Judah uses her. She wisely takes his signet ring and staff to show who has done this. And when she gets pregnant and Judah's ready to put her to death, she says, well, by the way, the father of these children, or this child, is the one who owns the signet ring. And he realizes that it is his, and he makes the significant words in verse 26, she is more righteous than I, because I didn't give her to my son Shelah. So he doesn't go into her again, but she actually ends up with twins. And the twins that are born to Tamar are Perez and Zerah. These 2 boys are significant because, again, we're going to have the line that's going to bring about, first of all, the Davidic king, and then ultimately Messiah, and that's through Perez. So it's certainly important genealogically, but I think it's also very important to see what God is doing in the family and to see where Judah is coming from when we recognize the working of God in his life. Is it possible that this is the turning point in Judah's life? Perhaps. I'm not sure that it's quite that clear here, even though he certainly does say she's more righteous than I, but there's certainly a recognition of the fact that he's been in the wrong. These images actually come from ancient Egypt. They've been recreated, so it's not the originals, but it is a recreation of some actual images from some of the texts that we have in Egypt. And what they show is a 2nd millennium BC group of people coming from Canaan into Egypt. And just because it's that time period, and because these, of course, are probably very much like the Canaanites, this is probably very much like what Joseph and his family would have looked like as they're coming into Egypt. And I just thought this was fascinating. And you get a good look at what Joseph, perhaps, or his family looked like with the, the interesting dress, the men having the shorter kilt style, and the women having the longer mid-thigh dresses and so on. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So Joseph goes to Egypt. Of course, you know the story. We don't have to rehearse it all. Potiphar's wife is a Jezebel. She tries to seduce him. And of course, Joseph is stellar in his refusal. And he continually rebuffs her and continually rebuffs her until she corners him. And then he simply says to her in verse 9 of chapter 39, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Even though he says that, she won't listen. She tries to grab him and make him, and he actually ends up leaving his cloak in her hand and running out of the house. And when she saw that she had it, she uses that to accuse him. And when the master comes home, the master throws him in jail. Now, a couple things you need to notice. First of all, I'm not convinced the master actually believed his wife completely, but he didn't have enough reason not to. And so he has to do something. He certainly doesn't have him put to death, which I would expect he could have, but doesn't. But the second thing I wanted you to notice is he throws him into the prison. In verse 20, it says it's the prison where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now, before we get to what God does with him there, I want you to notice something else. In the very next chapter, Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody, in verse 3, in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. Hold on a second. Who was the captain of the guard? Oh, wow. Go back to chapter 39, verse 1. Potiphar. Where does Joseph go? To the basement. Potiphar throws Joseph into his own dungeon, straight in the bottom of his house. Now, there's some interesting poetic justice there, I suppose. I don't know if that would have made it easier for Joseph or harder for Joseph, but it is, in fact, significant because of how God is going to use this. God is going to use the very choice of Potiphar to accomplish God's plan. So back up to the end of chapter 39, verse 21, just as we saw back in verse 3, or verse 2 and 3. So 2 and 3 of verse 39 says the Lord was with Joseph. This is in Potiphar's house. And in verse 3, his master saw the Lord was with him. And so God gave, or the Potiphar gave everything into Joseph's hand, and the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. That's verse 5. Same thing happens again, verse 21. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. One of those key words in the Old Testament. He gives him his chesed, his loyal love, and gave him favor. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of everything. And whatever there was, he got it. And of course, verse 23, the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. God is raising up Joseph, and then he goes even lower, and he raises him up, and he goes even lower, and he raises him up. And God is at work. Of course, with the story of the two men, the chief butler and the chief baker, thrown in prison, Joseph interprets their dreams, and that's another thing that we probably should notice real quick. Dreams are a significant part of the Joseph stories. Why? Good question. Glad you asked. Perhaps because this is a time period in which dreams are incredibly significant for Egypt. During this time period, there are books that we have discovered, or scrolls from Egypt that have, not me, but archaeologists have discovered that have actual recipes for how to interpret dreams. So they have the symbols, and this is what it must mean, and in this context, this is what it means, etc. Now, Joseph has the dreams, but Joseph interprets the dreams, and God prepares him for the perfect time. He has him ready to go. So when these guys have their dreams, Joseph understands it, God gives him the answer, and they happen just as Joseph says. So even in the use of dreams and the way God is working, he's working in a way that the Egyptians will understand. He's speaking their language. So the chief baker is killed, and the chief butler is put back in his position as cupbearer before the king. Joseph, of course, asked for him to please remember me, but he doesn't until 2 years later when Pharaoh has another dream and he says, oh, I just remembered. And of course, Joseph says, man, I wish you'd have thought of this a while back. So the cupbearer remembers his offense. The Pharaoh calls on Joseph. Joseph gives him the answer to the dream, and the Pharaoh recognizes that this is the guy I've got to put in my own service. So he uses Joseph to be able to bring prosperity to the kingdom and use the times of great plenty to prepare for the times of great famine. Of course, all this is preparatory for the brothers coming to Egypt. When the famine comes, the brothers come to Egypt. Joseph recognizes them. And I've often thought about this one. This is a test for the brothers, or is it? This is a test for Joseph too, isn't it? Can you imagine having somebody who has perpetrated such great evil against you, and now all of a sudden you have complete control over them? You have nobody who cares, and you have all the authority to do whatever you want to do. What would you do? Well, Joseph, in a very short time, he doesn't dwell on it, but he chooses, and what he chooses is wise. What he chooses is useful. What he chooses is productive. And so he chooses to keep one of their brothers to try to make sure that they come back, and he decides to send them home. He sends them home, however, with the money in the bag. Again, what is he doing? Except perhaps testing his brothers. They, of course, get home, and Dad is really upset because, honestly, not so much because of Simeon, but because they told him about Benjamin, and he has said, you can't come back without Benjamin. It takes a year for them to eat all their food and realize they have no other option, or probably nearly a year. And we have them needing to go back. One more time, we need to go back to the text. So take a look at how it works. When his father says you need to go back, Reuben says, okay, I'll take responsibility. If we don't get back, you can kill my boys. That's in chapter 42, verse 37. He just doesn't get it, does he? Reuben isn't really willing to take personal responsibility. And Jacob says, that's really not what I'm looking for. I don't really need to lose 2 grandsons so that I can get because I've lost a son. So as it gets worse, Judah says, I will take full responsibility. It's a very different proposition. So Judah says, hold me personally responsible. Whatever happens to him, I will take care of it. Now, all during this time, I need to notice one more thing. As we have already seen, and as we recognize, God is at work in the lives of these brothers, but how do we see it in the text? Well, back in chapter 42 and verse 21, they're feeling very guilty. And when Simeon is left, and when they have to bring Benjamin back, look at what they say. In truth, we're guilty concerning our brother. We saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we didn't listen. This is 20 years later. Can you imagine? They are still feeling incredible guilt as they recognize and vividly replay the selling of their brother into Egypt. Joseph's last test is going to reveal their attitude towards Benjamin. So he puts the cup in their sacks. Of course, you know the story. They all come back, and they're all ready to stay. And then Judah pleads that Joseph send Benjamin back and keep Judah himself as his slave. And Joseph says, no, I don't want another slave. I want Benjamin. And Judah's speech, I think, is very significant. He says in verse 29, and chapter 44 is just a beautiful, beautiful response. But in verse 29, he says, if you take this also from me, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs to evil and Sheol. So he's recounting the speech of his father. So now, therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father, and the boy's not with us, his life is bound up in the life of the boys. As soon as he sees the boy's not with us, he'll die. So he says, please, therefore, verse 33, let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy's not with us? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. he has definitely changed. So what we see is not just Joseph's purpose of testing his brothers, but I believe we see God's purpose of demonstrating the change in the hearts of the brothers for blessing. Indeed, God has seen, God does know, and in fact, God has been at work in their lives. So what we see in all of this, Judah is willing to take responsibility. Judah loves his brother. Judah takes charge. Judah takes leadership. Judah fulfills his promise to his father. Judah is doing exactly what Judah should be doing as the leader of the pack. Now, he's not the oldest brother. You've learned the order of the brothers. So Reuben is the firstborn, but Reuben doesn't take the lead. We're going to see later that he also is foolish, and because of that, he's going to lose both birthright and blessing. On the other hand, the next two oldest, Simeon and Levi, they also have already forfeited the right to leadership by killing, destroying, wiping out all of the Shechemites because of the rape of their sister Dinah. So Judah is the next one in line, and he indeed does take responsibility, and he does fulfill his responsibility as brother to love his brother, to take care of his father. And I think we also see the repentance of the brothers before God. So all of this, I think God is orchestrating this. He probably put this into Joseph's mind, but we see both Joseph's heart testing his brothers and God's use of him to demonstrate what he has been doing in the lives of the brothers over the last 20 years.